Good morning. Thank y'all for coming. Thanks to the TCU Center for Texas Studies and the Fort Worth Public Library for hosting this event and for the invitation to speak here this morning. I've found that learning can be a continuous experience if we let it be. Just last week, for example, I learned that the diet of a horned frog includes wolverines. And hopefully Monday we'll learn that it includes bulldogs. We'll see how this comes out. So good luck to TCU. All right, so our program today, I changed up the order a little bit to Longhorns, Life on the Trail, and the Legends. The cattle came before the trails, and both came before the legends. So I changed that up a little bit. And can y'all, Y'all tell me if you can't see, and I'll move. So these are some of the sources of trails information that we're all exposed to when we watch good old Hollywood Westerns or we read books or magazines or whatever. Hollywood Westerns, I watched them as a kid and I still watch them. My wife still catches me watching The Lone Ranger once in a while, and, The Rifleman and Rawhide and all of those good shows. We get information from various forms of literature. It's important to remember that some of these are secondary sources, some are primary sources. My book, for example, is a secondary source, but I rely heavily on the primary sources, and I let those tell the story versus having a story predetermined that I want to tell and cherry picking certain sources to support the story that I want to tell. I just throw the evidence out there and let it let the chips fall where they may, or let the cow chips fall where they may in this case. Historical markers, some are more accurate than others, and folklore, myth, and legend. It's important to remember that these are popular beliefs or traditions. A lot of people might believe it, but by definition, the story can't be proven. Think the Goat Man of Lake Worth in 1969. Certain elements of the story can be proven, but when it comes down to it, can't prove it. This is just a high-level trails timeline, and 2017 was the sesquicentennial anniversary of the Chisholm Trail, and that's the trail name that comes to mind anytime anyone talks about the cattle drives. It's kind of overshadowed everything else. But during this sesquicentennial period, there was all kinds of claims being made to establish local ties to the Chisholm Trail from the Rio Grande all the way up to Kansas. There was all sorts of fertilizer being spread that wasn't true, wasn't even close to true. For example, there were claims that the first cattle drive of any significance occurred on the Chisholm Trail. The cowboy was invented on the Chisholm Trail. Stetson invented the hat, the Western hat. The Stetson was invented on the Chisholm Trail. That's all baloney. Organized cattle drives had been happening in Texas since 1779. Settlers from Stephen F. Austin's Old 300 soon began rounding up and driving wild cattle to market in New Orleans. Now, those herds were considerably smaller because they had to navigate through the swamps because of the lay of the land. But this is just kind of a high-level timeline here. Chisholm Trail came along in 1867. A little bit later, as railroads and population and quarantine laws pushed the frontier line off to the west, then the Western Trail to Dodge City, Ogallala, and points beyond came along. And then the Kansas legislature in 1885 passed a law that quarantined the entire state of Kansas, made it illegal to drive Texas cattle anywhere into Kansas unless the cattle had been wintered north of the 36th parallel, which is basically the top line of the Texas Panhandle, and had the proper health certificates that were available from your local inspector for a fee. So that pretty much turned the faucet off on the long trail drives. There were a few that continued up until the mid-1890s. The last drive was by the XIT Ranch to Montana from the Panhandle of Texas. So you may have read that some in different places that at the end of the Civil War, cattle were worth about $1 or $2 a head here in Texas. Well, according to newspaper ads and sale auction ads, tax roll information, these cattle were actually worth about $5 to $8 a head here in Texas. So they were worth a little more than what was initially thought. And it depends on the location and the grade of the cattle. The grade of the cattle simply means the type of cattle and the condition of the cattle. For example, a 2 or 3 year old steer was worth more than an 18-year-old cow. So it depended on location, grade. This gives you an idea of, a general idea of the potential economics of a trail drive if you were in Texas in 1867. This new railhead had just opened in Abilene, Kansas, over in central Kansas, so you didn't have to worry about all the swindlers and cattle thieves and all the jayhawkers and bushwhackers that were causing trouble still along the Missouri-Kansas border. You could go to central Kansas, bypass all of that, and this just gives you a general idea of the potential economics. If you could put together a herd, make it safely to Kansas, even if you didn't sell at top dollar, if you only sold for 25, 30 bucks a head, you still stood to make quite a bit of change. So it was a very economically viable prospect. Now this is what the real Cowboys look like. The photo on the left is George W. Saunders there on the bottom, seated on the left, along with a few others taken at the end of a trail drive to Dodge City in 1884. Now these were what the real Cowboys looked like. George Saunders made many trips up the trails to various destinations, including the Texas Gulf Coast, New Orleans, different destinations in Kansas and other places. He went on to establish the Saunders Commission Company that had offices in San Antonio, Fort Worth, Kansas City, and there was one other location up in the Midwest that stayed in business, I think, until the late 1950s. He also, in 1915, was one of the founding members and longtime president of the Old Trail Drivers Association of Texas. We don't know who the fella is there on the right, but he's representative of the cowboy or the drover that you would have seen on the cattle trails. These are the Hollywood real cowboys. Yeah. Now, Randolph Scott there. I think this was from the movie with Joel McCrea, but I don't remember for sure. And then John Wayne there from the movie Red River, carrying his famous 6-shooter that fires about 18 to 20 times before it needs to be reloaded. Some of the hardships and risks on the trail. Before you could have a cattle drive and drive them to Kansas, you needed horses. That's a long walk, especially if you're herding a couple of thousand head of wild cattle. So if you can afford it, you can buy horses. Your other option is to capture, break, and train your own. At this time in Texas, there were only about 600,000 people in the entire state of Texas, and if you drew a line from roughly Gainesville to Fort Worth to San Antonio to Corpus Christi, most of that population would have been east of that line. So Texas was wide open. You didn't round up horses. That term came along later. You gathered horses or you went on a wild horse hunt. Same with cattle. You didn't round up cattle. You went on cow hunts and you gathered cattle. And these were not the Longhorns that we see walking down Exchange Street twice a day out in the stockyards, or typically at the Fort Worth Stock Show. These were wild cattle, and we'll see some photos coming up. These cattle, I put this slide together for a fictional cattle drive from Nueces County north to Kansas. So down in that part of the state, these cattle would hide out during the day in the thickest, thorniest cover they could find, brush and cactus, and they would come out at night to graze in water. So if there was enough moonlight, you could capture cattle at night when they came out, or you could go in after them. If the cover was such that you could not throw a lasso, there was a method called tailing that entailed you're on horseback, you run alongside the running animal, you reach out, grab it by the tail, you're still on horseback, hopefully, and try to jerk it off balance or wrap the tail around the saddle horn to cause it to stumble and fall. Now, if you were successful and the animal stumbled and fell, now you have to stop, dismount, run over to the fallen animal and tie it before it can get up and charge at you and try to kill you. So that was one method of catching these cattle. They also used dogs in certain areas to bring them out and that sort of thing. But the goal was, once you caught them, you had to hold them in small groups until their herd instinct overcame their instinct to escape. One way they did that was what they called necking, where they would take a short rope or rawhide or whatever and tie that steer to if there were any trees, tie it to a tree, or tie those cattle to cattle that were already inclined not to run off. And then after a period of time, then they would eventually not want to run off. One old cowboy said that these were considered gentle if they did not immediately spook at the sight of a man on horseback or immediately charge at you and try to kill you. So these were different cattle. So what is a Texas Longhorn? We're talking about bovines, not University of Texas football players. These cattle were descendants of 4 breeds of Iberian cattle, 2 Spanish breeds, 2 Portuguese breeds. These were first brought over to the New World in Columbus's second voyage in 1493. With each new exploration, they brought additional cattle because they had to carry their supplies with them, and cattle was part of that. Once they got over here, there were no fences. It was all open range, so these cattle were basically turned loose, and additional stock arrived with each exploration. They were eventually brought over to northern New Mexico and to the mainland, and that's where these 4 breeds of cattle, the process of natural selection over a period of about 300 years, eventually produced what we call today the Texas Longhorn. These are 2 of the breeds, the Retinto and the Lydia. The bull there on the right is also known as the Spanish Fighting Bull. And we can see characteristics of the Longhorn in each one of these breeds. And then the Alantahana and Mertalinga. They produced the Longhorn and characteristics of these Longhorns. Again, natural selection over a long period of time. These were wild cattle. If domestic cattle escaped and tried to enter a wild herd, they would kill the domestic cattle. They could rustle their own food. They could eat pretty much anything. They had an extremely high percentage of live births. Their calves could get on their feet a lot quicker than domestic cattle, which was important to survive in the wild. And it was said that they could walk all day on a mouthful of grass and a drink of water. So they were basically built for long cattle drives. So everything just kind of fell into place here. These cattle are from the state of Texas Longhorn herd. These are out at Fort Griffin. I spent the day with Will Craddock one day when I was doing research, and he took me to one of the ranches where they keep part of the herd that the public doesn't get to see, doesn't generally get to see. And these cattle are raised, whatever the natural range is, that's what they eat. They do some supplemental feeding occasionally, depending on weather and range conditions, but other than that, it's strictly range, just like it was 200 years ago. This is one of the herd bulls. He let me walk up and scratch him on the nose after I took this picture. But notice some of the characteristics. We don't have a pointer, but notice that the rectangular facial profile, the horn structure of the bull versus the horn structure of the cow in the background. The bull's horns are designed for fighting. Notice that a dewlap is that big flap of skin that hangs down from a cow's chest. You don't see that on these cattle, and they're lean, trim, and they're built to survive in the wild. You don't see anything extra there. Now, starting in the mid-1870s, they were crossbred with English breeds, Shorthorns, Herefords, etc., to improve meat production. That beginning in the 1920s, they were crossbred to produce certain colors, certain characteristics like longer horns. That's when the arguments and the contest started going, hey, I got a bull or a steer with horns longer than yours. And so they started crossbreeding. The bull on the left, these two bulls are an example of what has happened with crossbreeding. The bull on the left is billed as the Longhorn bull with the world's widest horn spread, 8.6 feet. He was in Texas. I don't know if he's been sold since I put this slide together, but notice the more triangular facial profile, the big dewlap hanging down, and he doesn't look anything like the bull we just saw. And then the one on the right, I don't know what the heck they did to that bull, but that is somebody in Ohio's idea of what a world champion Longhorn bull should look like. This is one of the cows back to the state herd out at Fort Griffin. And you can look up the herd on the internet. They keep parts of the herd in different places. These were out at Fort Griffin. Again, note lack of a big dewlap hanging down. Note the slim lines, the horn structure, that little twist up toward the end of the horns there. That's called a Texas twist. You basically don't see anything extra there that could get hung up in brush. So they're built to survive in the wild. This is a group of the steers out there. Again, these are all products of, they don't do any crossbreeding out there. They just put them out there. They control the herd and all of that, but they don't do any specific crossbreeding to produce certain characteristics. These are all natural. So some of this mythology and reality, if we were on a cattle drive, every Western you've probably ever seen that involves a cattle drive, what do you do to start the herd? You hoot, holler, fire off your 6 shooters and raise all kinds of ruckus. Well, if you did that, you'd probably start a stampede, and you might spend several weeks gathering your herd up and hope half your crew didn't get killed in the process. So you didn't do that. One old cowboy later said that you didn't drive Longhorn cattle anywhere. The trick was to get them to think it was their idea to go there. Rawhide, Rowdy Yates and Gil Favor and that crew, how many times do they go off and rescue some settler woman that's in some sort of peril or something like that? Well, the reality was that if you left South Texas on a trail drive to Kansas or pretty much anywhere else, chances are you would not see another human being until you got to your destination. So that's all a bunch of bull too. And then the concept of a fair gunfight where the drovers, where Rowdy Yates or whoever, the good guy faces off with the bad guy, and the good guy always lets the bad guy draw first and somehow shoots the gun out of his hand or whatever. Well, that didn't really happen either. The name of the game was to get the drop on your opponent. Fairness was not a factor, and most of those situations were more ambush situations than anything else. Now, these are the positions on a cattle drive. The chuck wagon would ride out front off to one side. The trail boss would lead the way. He would select the route, make sure there was good grass and water along the way for the cattle and the horses. select the river crossings. The point riders that you see there, they would guide the herd, not lead the herd. Remember, you don't drive Longhorns anyway. They would point the way, keep the herd pointed in the right direction. The swing and flank riders they controlled the width of the herd. If these animals generate a lot of body heat, if they let them squeeze down too close together, they would overheat and lose weight. And the name of the game was to keep them in a sellable condition and in good condition when they got to market. So you didn't want them to lose weight. You also didn't want to let them spread out too much, because then they would trot to try to catch up with the cattle in front, and they would lose weight. So this was more of a science than anything else that you learned from experience. And then the drag riders were bringing up the rear. These are the guys that got to eat all the dust. And then the wrangler was usually the least experienced of the crew, and he took care of the horses. All right, if we started in somewhere south of San Antonio, for this particular slide was for an Nueces County origin. So we start somewhere south of San Antonio. We might stop for supplies in San Antonio. We'll go past Austin and Waco. We can get supplies in those locations. Fort Worth, and that's been said that Fort Worth was the last stop for supplies before entering in Indian Territory. Well, that's not true. Before Fort Arbuckle closed in Indian Territory in 1870, cattle herds crossed into Indian Territory in the Gainesville area. They did not go northwest to Montague County and Red River Station until after Fort Arbuckle closed in 1870. So you could also, your selection might not have been as good, because Gainesville was not as populated as Fort Worth was back then. Fort Worth wasn't real populated, so it's not saying a whole lot. But you could still get supplies at Gainesville. Later, after the trail shifted a little bit west to Red River Station, you could still get supplies at Red River Station. So some of this stuff, this is one of those efforts that have been made over a period of years to link a community to the trail and the cattle driving period. That's not really true. These are some of the hazards you'll face on the trail. Bad diet, bad water. Y'all ever had any bad water that caused problems? They didn't have Pepto-Bismol and all that other good stuff that we have today. You just had to deal with it on the trail. You didn't have aspirin every time you got a headache, or Tylenol or whatever. By broken limbs, I don't mean tree limbs. I mean arms, legs, and fingers, necks, backs, whatever. Loneliness was a big deal, and we know this from a couple of diaries and some letters that were written during this period, written from drovers on the trail. The hazards of working with livestock. Remember, these cattle are wild cattle. Kick, stomp, gored, bit, run over. These cattle could stampede at nothing more than a cowboy's sneeze or a horse's snort or a coyote's howl. Most often, thunderstorms cause stampedes at night. So they could stampede basically any time for any reason, or sometimes for no apparent reason. I think it was Charles Goodnight wrote about one drive that he was on, that every night the cattle would stampede, and so he had all of his men out watching to try to figure out why they were running, and they finally figured out that there was one particular white cow that would just jump up and take off running, and when that happened, the whole herd, it was like turning on a light switch. The whole herd would run all at once. It was not a gradual thing. One was up, they were all up and running, and it was just like that. So once they figured out the problem, he told one of his cowboys to cut that white cow out of the herd and hold it until after they left, and then shoot it. And he did. No more stampedes the rest of the drive. James Cook, one of the old trail drivers, said in 1923 that basically if you're on a trail drive and you get injured, wounded, or sick, you are out of luck. Your best bet is a quick recovery or a sudden death, because there are no doctors or medical attention. Your doctor was probably the cook that used things like kerosene and chewing tobacco and things like that to medicate you. So if you make it safely to your destination, it might be Abilene, Ellsworth, or any number of destinations as they became available. The herd was sold, the crew was paid. You've probably been wearing the same clothes for the last month, most of the last month or two. If you're lucky, you had a change of clothes in your saddle bags. So you might buy new clothes, celebrate a little bit, and look out for those activities designed to separate you from your paycheck. Sometimes these drovers would hire on with other outfits because new ranches were being established during this time in Kansas and other places. So they might hire on and stay up there and go to work for another outfit. Or they might come back to Texas. Some might have had their fill with one cattle drive and go find something else to do. Others might have turned right around and done it again the next year. So let's talk some about the legend. I found doing research and talking to people that when it comes to the cattle trails, and especially the Chisholm Trail, some folks seem to forget these definitions or make up their own definition to fit whatever their point of view is. So let's just do a quick review. Folklore, body of, and I compiled these from several different online dictionaries. A body of popular myth or beliefs with a basis in reality or fictional. Example given was Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Legendary, described in or based on legend. Famous, well-known, or celebrated. Legend, a traditional story believed by many, but unauthenticated. A myth, fable, fairy tale. Example given was King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. All right? And then hearsay evidence. This is based on somebody else's statement. Hearsay is typically inadmissible in court because that by its nature, it is inherently unreliable. Because you might be relaying a story that I told you or somebody else told you that may or may not have a basis in fact, but you don't have it. You have to go out and find evidence to prove it. So a lot of what we read about the cattle drives, these throws out some big numbers. There's an estimated 6 million to 10 million head of cattle driven north from Texas after the Civil War. These estimates vary based on the source, and they range as high as 20 million. According to I don't know if I have to put my glasses on to read this off the screen or not. According to an 1885 report by the U.S. Bureau of Statistics that I found, which is the only source that I found that actually publishes these numbers. From 1866 through 1884, there were an estimated 5,400,000 head of cattle driven north from Texas. And this includes for any purpose, whether it was for sale at a railhead to establish another ranch in Colorado or Wyoming or somewhere else or anything. This supposedly includes all of these numbers, and these were compiled from various sources, like the Kansas Board of Trade and different boards of trade and different sources to get these numbers. Again, these estimates range up to 20 million. 2,400,000 of these were driven north during the Chisholm Trail's primary years of use, which was 1867 through 1875. In 1876, the cattle market opened at Dodge City, and most of this herd traffic shifted over to the Western Trail that went crossed the Red River in Will Barker County, north of Vernon, Texas, went past Fort Supply in western Oklahoma, western Indian Territory, and then on to Dodge City and Ogallala and points beyond. Most of these herds shifted over to the newer markets because of better rates, better freight rates, better prices, etc. Plus the quarantine laws kept moving. This report ends in after 1884 because of the Kansas quarantine in 1885. That turned off the faucet, so there was not much more to report after that. Another indication of the significance of the cattle business, this was not, it's just a bunch of cows, what's the big deal? Well, the big deal was that in 1 year, 1884, U.S. cattle and beef products exported from the United States amounted to $41 million, which is over $1 billion in today's market. Texas cattle accounted for 95% of that money. A lot of that was coming back to the state, which was basically bankrupt after the Civil War. So it was a big deal. All right. One of the biggest things when it comes to cattle trail legends is the name and location of the Chisholm Trail. People have been arguing about this for over 100 years. During the 1920s and 1930s, as these old trail drivers were getting up in age and beginning to die out, and articles were being written and books were being written and they were being interviewed for these stories, there were some old cowboys that referred to the Texas portion of the trail as the Chisholm Trail. Those are the ones that we usually hear about from folks that promote the Chisholm Trail. The ones we don't usually hear about are all those other cowboys that contradicted that story and said, no, the Chisholm Trail was struck up in Indian Territory. It never did come into Texas. And when we look at the letters and diaries that survive the term Chisholm Trail, these cowboys and cattlemen, the cattle owners, they tended to talk more in terms of their destination. They did not use trail names. They didn't seem to care about the name of the trail. They cared about where they were going to sell their cattle and how they were going to get there. The term Chisholm Trail, when somebody tells me, I've got a letter from an ancestor that wrote it during the trail driving days and it says Chisholm Trail. I said, well, I sure would like to see a copy of that. And out of all the people that have told me that so far, it has either turned out to be after 1911, dated after 1911, or I never hear from them again. Go figure. We try to corroborate. We've got different stories. Well, this is a trail driver. That's a trail driver. They both have all this experience. This is both firsthand information coming from these guys, but it's 50 years after the fact. I just had my 50th high school reunion, and we were telling some whoppers then, too. So you have to corroborate the information. Problems with these accounts are, we see it in the old trail driver accounts during this period, they're inconsistent and contradictory. This trail driver says it's Chisholm Trail. That trail driver says it's not. Who do you believe? You have to find some other piece of information to help figure out, not necessarily that someone is lying, but which is good information and which is not so good information. We have the same problems if we look at newspaper accounts from the trail driving period, 1867 through 1884. We find inconsistent use of trail names. A guy in Kansas told me several years ago that, this whole trail is the Chisholm Trail because the Emporia News and the Wichita Eagle called it the Chisholm Trail. But then when you go look up those articles that he refers to, they're only talking about a specific portion of the trail up in the northern part of Indian Territory or extreme southern Kansas. And then when you review other articles during the period, you find that the term Texas Cattle Trail was also used by both of those newspapers one or both of those newspapers to describe the same cattle trail during the same period, and you find that the Texas Cattle Trail was actually used a little more frequently than Chisholm Trail. So if your argument is that it's the Chisholm Trail because the newspaper said so, then I pointed this out. I said, well, yeah, if it's the Chisholm Trail because the newspaper said so, Texas Cattle Trail appears multiple times, or more times than the Chisholm Trail does during this period. And the newspaper that you told me about also used Texas Cattle Trail. So your argument actually supports Texas Cattle Trail more than it supports Chisholm Trail. Well, I hadn't heard from him in several years. So, books about the cattle business published from 1874 through 1905. There's 4 books called the Big Four that describe the early cattle business in Texas and the United States that were written during and immediately after the trail driving period. In these books, there's over 2,100 pages that also include over 400 biographical sketches of cattlemen, most of whom, if not all of them, were trail drivers at one point. Use of the term Chisholm Trail is negligible. It only appears a couple of times, 4 times total in all of these books. This is a map from Texas Historical Commission in 2002, from a 2002 brochure. I like to use, this is an older map. They have newer maps in the newer brochures, but I like to use this one because it focuses on what's billed as the Chisholm Trail, and it looks good on a slide. And I like the way the shaded area indicates how herds that were gathered over thousands of square miles south of the Brazos River and on down into South Texas just naturally funneled into a main trail route wherever it made sense. They show this trail at the main trail beginning at San Antonio, past Austin, Waco, Fort Worth, across the Red River at Red River Station. Do y'all know where that is in Montague County? You know where Bowie is? Okay, if you go north and just slightly west from Bowie, that's Red River Station. There's not much there now except a couple of markers and a graveyard. And if you go to the graveyard during the warm weather months, you better watch out for rattlesnakes. And then it continued on north through Indian Territory, which Oklahoma was not a state at that point, generally along and east of the present route of US Highway 81, and then on to Abilene and later to Ellsworth and other destinations as new railheads became available in Kansas. Now, this trail route from San Antonio all the way to central Kansas runs generally along the route of US Highway 81. And when that was built, it was built in the early 20th century, beginning around 1911 as the Meridian Highway. Good roads associations in northern Oklahoma and southern Kansas immediately started a push to name the entire Meridian Highway from Mexico all the way to Canada after the Chisholm Trail and call it the Chisholm Trail Highway. So a lot of this relates back to that versus, well, that's what the Cowboys called it. But when you do the research, you find that it's promoters, not the Cowboys and cattlemen. This is a National Park Service map from their recent National Historic Trails project. This map was part of the paperwork that was submitted to Congress in spring of 2019. The trail on the left is the Western Trail. It's the one that went to Dodge City, Ogallala, and points beyond. The trail on the right, it's the proposed Western National Historic Trail. The trail on the right is the proposed Chisholm National Historic Trail. Both of these on maps prior to this, these project maps, these trails both originated at or near San Antonio. For some reason, the final version of the map that went to Congress with all the paperwork, the origin had been changed to Kingsville, which didn't even exist as a town during this period. The King Ranch existed down there, but but Kingsville did not exist until early 1900s. There's no explanation in the National Park Service paperwork for the change. A couple of emails and phone calls to National Park Service out in New Mexico that handled this project have gone unanswered. They apparently don't want to talk about why they changed it. So there's probably some backroom marketing deals going on, and they were lobbied to change it to Kingsville for some reason. But this is another one of those things that one map several years ago said one thing, another map that the same organization published changed with no explanation, and they don't want to talk about it. So these are the things you get into with the Chisholm Trail. This is the cover of the present Chisholm Trail brochure from Texas Historical Commission. And I had seen this brochure and cover countless times. And I was preparing a presentation for an event, and then it dawned on me, hey, wait a minute. Look at this cover. Look down here at the title. It says, Exploring the Folklore and Legacy. This is the Texas Historical Commission. Why doesn't it say Exploring the History and Legacy? Remember that definition of folklore? Can't prove it. And then I thought, wait a minute. Is this a way to walk the middle of the road without committing one way or the other? But this is Texas Historical Commission. Their purpose and the County Historical Commission's purpose is to preserve and present the real history, and preserve those documents and present those documents to the public. Is this their way of saying, here's the information, but it's all false? I don't know. It's a myth. I don't know. Hadn't found anybody yet that wants to talk about it. So here's the big question. Why is the cattle trail in Texas called the Chisholm Trail? And you see this in print. You get these answers when you ask somebody, because somebody said so during the 1920s and 1930s. Well, because Texas cowboys and cattlemen called it the Chisholm Trail. Well, because J. Frank Dobie, Wayne Gard, or another author said so in their books. Well, remember that definition of hearsay evidence? Because somebody else said so? We can, a lot of that goes back to hearsay evidence. You also see, because Jesse Chisholm's Trail, now this one sounds a little better, because Jesse Chisholm's Trail extended from Wichita, Kansas, south to the Red River. But we can check that on the maps, and we'll see a couple of historic maps coming up. Or back to that newspaper argument, because a newspaper during that trailing period used the term Chisholm Trail. But remember, a lot of that stuff is inconsistent, and we still need to corroborate. We either have to select a story that we like and stick with it, or we have to flip a coin to decide which story to go with, or we can do some further research and corroborate the information to see if we can determine what is factually true versus what somebody thinks is true. Now, the answer you don't hear when you ask that question is because the primary documents say so. Ask even our own Tarrant County Historical Commission several years ago, and the staff, the personnel has probably turned over since then. I don't know. I haven't kept up with it, but I sent an email several years ago asking them if they would be interested in any of these maps that I have found regarding the alleged Chisholm Trail through Fort Worth in Tarrant County. The paraphrased answer I got back was, we checked with our trails guy, and J. Frank Dobie said in 1930 that it's the Chisholm Trail, so it's the Chisholm Trail, and we're not inclined to discuss the matter. So, go figure. That may change someday because this information is coming out more and more, a lot of it through sessions like this. and more people asking questions than just a handful of us. But the answer we don't hear from the promoters like this is because the documents say so. They don't want to talk about the primary documents because they contradict the story. And remember, the primary sources are firsthand information and documents created during the relevant period of study, not what somebody thinks 50 years later. All right, now I'm going to have to put my glasses on this one. This is an example. I'm not picking on Wayne Gard. I love this book. I keep it. This is one of the books I keep handy when I'm doing research. But this is just an example to show of how the story has moved from fact to legend over a period of years. And it's not just Wayne Gard's book. I just use this as an example because I had his book handy and because it's a good example. Top of the page, this is page 76 out of the book. He makes a statement that the trail was frequently called the Chisholm Trail, and that trail name was applied to the entire trail route, including the many feeder branches and terminals. He does not provide, at the bottom of the page, he does not provide a footnote reference to support that statement. The next sentence appears to support that statement. When you read it, a Texas newspaper in 1874 referred to cattle going up the famous Chisholm Trail, and he footnotes that one. That was the Denison Daily News, April 18, 1874. So to the casual reader, and all those times that I had read that before I started doing research, okay, that sounds good. The newspaper article says so, okay. So there's his evidence. And then you read on down there, first paragraph, he continues and says that government maps published through the 1870s show this route as the Abilene Cattle Trail. And then go a little further, and he mentions maps published by the Kansas Pacific Railway that show it as the Great Texas Cattle Trail. So he's listed these primary sources, and then when I started working on this project, and people, including Rick there, talked me into writing a book, I went back to this and thought, wait a minute, Wayne Gard was an author and a historian. Why the heck did he not footnote these primary sources down here? I don't know. It's pure speculation. But he makes this statement, and then he doesn't support it with evidence, which basically makes it an opinion. And then read on down to the middle there, he refers to T.C. Richardson, another historian back in the day, that made the statement, last part of the sentence down there, that, let's see, many an old timer who as a boy saw herds of stately Longhorns piloted by bandanaed, booted, and spurred men lived with the firm conviction that the Dodge or Chisholm Trail passed right over yonder. Man, that sounds great, doesn't it? But what it amounts to is some people thought it was the Chisholm Trail, right? No footnote evidence to support that, other than the article where T.C. Richardson, where that quote came from. And then down at the last paragraph, he starts it off. The main stem of the Chisholm Trail began at the Rio Grande. Again, no supporting evidence for that statement. The problem is that these statements have been taken as gospel because Wayne Gard said so, but then when you go back to it and you start looking at it, he said so, but he doesn't offer any supporting evidence to support his statement. So it's basically just an opinion. And I'd like to be able to ask him, why didn't you footnote these primary sources? But it's all speculation. So here's a problem. You're a researcher. Maybe you're researching the Chisholm Trail. You find some original primary documents, but the primary documents do not support the story that you have in mind that you want to tell, or they contradict the story that you want to tell. What are you going to do? Do you say, oh man, I didn't know that. Well, I need to change my story based on this new evidence that I didn't know about. Do you do that? Do you go, I'll just shove this back off to the side and hope nobody else finds it until I'm dead and gone. Or what do? Well, apparently, beginning in the early 20th century, the solution was just redraw the map, alter the data, and misrepresent it. Change it to whatever you want it to be to fit your story. And I'll have some examples of that. We just saw one example. There are numerous examples of modern maps that show the Chisholm Trail in places it did not exist on surveys and maps during its historic period of use as a cattle trail. This is page 77 from Wayne, and again, I'm not picking on Wayne Gard. This is just a prime example of what we're talking about here. This is the map that he drew. This map is all over the internet. If you're in a social media history group talking about cattle trails, you're going to see this map at some point to prove that the Chisholm Trail existed somewhere. Note that he labels, I hope you can read it, it's hard to read, but he labels the Chisholm Trail from the Rio Grande all the way up to central Kansas. Now this map closely resembles the 1871 version of the Kansas Pacific Railway map that he mentioned on page 76, but he didn't provide a citation. If he had provided a citation, and this is just speculation, if he had provided a citation, I, as a reader or interested reader or researcher, might have seen the citation. Oh, this is from this map. Hey, this map is available on the internet. Boom, and I go look at it on the internet or go find it at a library somewhere, and then I compare this map with the map on page 77 and say, hey, wait a minute, what was Wayne Gard smoking? This map doesn't say anything about the Chisholm Trail. I don't know if that's why he didn't provide citations, but again, this is only one example. We see the same thing happen in numerous books that were written during the 20th century about this. You may have seen this, especially if you're in a social media Facebook history group. I don't know how many times I've seen this map posted as evidence by someone as evidence of the existence of the Chisholm Trail. When I first started doing research, a guy here in Fort Worth pulled this map out of a briefcase and said it's the Chisholm Trail through Fort Worth, and this map is proof. I said, wait a minute, and we'll zoom in a minute so you can see it. It says Chisholm Trail up there in Indian Territory. He said, yeah, but all these lines down here in Texas are all connected to that line up there in Indian Territory. Therefore, everything down here is the Chisholm Trail. So I started doing some research. There were some things about this map that didn't look correct. So I did some research and soon found that the author of the map, A.W. Ziegelash, there on the right, detail, was born in 1893. So this cannot be an authentic 1873 map. What has happened is he copied the 1873 Kansas Pacific Railway map. The later map detail is there on the left, original map on the right. The later map, you'll notice the Chisholm Trail in the later map labeling has been changed to Chisholm Trail from Ellsworth Cattle Trail on the original map. The original map went to Ellsworth as the original trail went to Ellsworth on the original map as it should, because the cattle business had been kicked out of Abilene by that time. He rerouted the main trail back to Abilene on the later map. The reason that this map exists, I think, is that Ziegelash worked during the 1920s for the state of Kansas as a draftsman. This was during the period when they were still pushing to get the Meridian Highway named as the Chisholm Trail Highway. So he probably did this for that project. I cannot think of any other logical explanation for the existence of this map. So here's another example where the primary document did not tell the story that somebody wanted to tell, so you just change it. And now this thing's all over the internet. Misinformation, fake news, as it were. This is another example. My source at Oklahoma State University tells me that the map referred to on the left, Indian Territory, from the United States Indian Bureau map of 1889, likely dates to 1951. I found the original Indian Bureau map from 1889 and compared the two. And in this detail on the left, the 1951 map leading from Courtney to Fort Arbuckle, there in the top right of the detail, is labeled the Jesse Chisholm Cattle Trail. Okay? The detail on the right, it's harder to see because of all the detail on the original map, but look at Courtney down there on the Red River and follow the dotted line up toward Fort Arbuckle in the top right of the detail. About halfway up, we see that it's labeled Cloud Road, not the Jesse Chisholm Cattle Trail. This road appears on several maps from the 1870s and 1880s as Cloud Road. So here's another example where somebody somewhere for some purpose, probably for a book, saw the original document, changed the information to fit the story that they were telling. These have all affected the narrative that we have today of the Chisholm Trail. These are a few other examples of maps that I know of where they've done the same thing. They represent or misrepresent the Chisholm Trail on a map in places that it did not exist on the original surveys or maps, including the Oklahoma Highway Commission map of 1933, the Oklahoma Highway Commission, and the National Park Service has also gotten into that act in their study sent to Congress. They reference the 1873, either the 1873 or 1875, I think, no, the 1875 Kansas Pacific map. It's referenced in their reference section as justification for 20 to 30 historic sites along the trail route, along the proposed National Historic Trail route. But the map that they cite doesn't say anything about the Chisholm Trail. It's Ellsworth Cattle Trail. So they've gotten into the act also of just change the date of whatever story you're trying to tell. This is the only known map of Texas that shows the cattle trail through Texas past Red River Station. This is an 1881 map that was done for a census report showing the movement of livestock in the United States. And we zoom in, the trail on the right there, we see it designated by the Interior Department as the Eastern Trail or Fort Worth Trail, likely because it was the easternmost cattle trail in use at the time, northbound cattle trail at the time, and it went past Fort Worth. Trail to the left, the Western Trail or Fort Griffin Trail, likely because it was the westernmost cattle trail in use at the time, and it went past Fort Griffin. So cattlemen kept it simple, Eastern Trail, Western Trail. There's Chisholm Trail promoters that have said, we can't call it the Eastern Trail. That sounds like something out of New York. We have to call it something. We can't call it that. So that's some of the thinking, and that's something else that has affected this narrative, especially over the last 20 years. This is a citation from one of the maps that Wayne Gard mentioned, published by the Interior Department. This is an 1879 map. And again, there was a whole series of these maps. I use this map because it shows up good on a slide. It shows all of these trails, but these maps are so big and they have so much detail, I traced over it so we could see it. The white dotted lines there indicate the network of trails that led from various fords on the Red River north of Gainesville up to Fort Arbuckle, where it kind of narrows down there, and then it fans out again to several other trail networks that cross the Canadian River and come together there at the solid white line. The solid white line represents what was surveyed and mapped as Chisholm's Trail or Chisholm's Cattle Trail. The circles there indicate, the lower one indicates Jesse Chisholm opened a trading post in that area in the 1840s. That was his first one. Then again in the 1850s up at the site that present site of Oklahoma City, and then another one at the site that became Wichita, Kansas, up off the top of the map. That trail that led past those trading posts, he used that to travel back and forth between his trading posts. It became known locally as Chisholm's Trail because he used that road to travel back and forth from his convenience stores. That was before a cow herd ever set foot on it. The trail on represented by the red line there That's the trail that led north from Red River Station. After Fort Arbuckle closed in 1870, they could still use the old route if they wanted to, but the trail shifted over to cross at Red River Station, and then you crossed at Red River Station about 5 or 6 miles to the northwest. You turned north, and that was surveyed as the Abilene Cattle Trail. I've got, I think there's about 45 or 46 survey plats that were taken during the height of the cattle drives, 1871, 1872 of Indian Territory, that describe and show these as Chisholm's Trail or Chisholm's Cattle Trail in that location and the Abilene Cattle Trail. You do not find that Chisholm Trail appears on any map from the trail driving period anywhere south of what you see on this map. This is the only place it was mapped as the Chisholm Trail during the entire trail driving period. That's a long way from Texas. And then there's just a better zoomed in view of the trading post. And then you go up to Kansas. This is an 1871 railroad and sectional map. These grid lines are township and section lines on this map. But we find that in 1871, the year that more cattle were driven north from Texas than any other year, so this was a peak year of the cattle drives. All of the trails in Kansas that go to all of the existing railheads, and Abilene is circled in green there at the top. All of these trails that go to all the existing railheads are designated as the Texas Cattle Trail, which corroborates those newspaper articles and those trail drivers that said that that was the Texas Cattle Trail. This is a list of maps from the cattle trailing era that show the Chisholm Trail anywhere in Texas, anywhere up US 81 through Oklahoma, or anywhere in Kansas. It's blank because they don't exist. They don't exist because, according to what we know from the primary documents, it didn't happen. These are a couple of the markers out in the stockyards. The concrete post there on the left was put up in summer of 2000. The marker there on the right was put up for the Chisholm Trail Sesquicentennial 2017. I've asked both organizations that were involved in this if they have any documentation from the trail driving days to support these markers, and the only answer I've got is, Frank Dobie said so in 1930. Other than that, it's crickets. They don't want to talk about it. There's a couple of other ways that the Chisholm Trail is commemorated here in Fort Worth. The Sundance Square mural and the Chisholm Trail Parkway. The Parkway had been on the planning stages as a Southwest Parkway since the 1960s. It opened during that ramp-up period for the Chisholm Trail Sesquicentennial. Then all of a sudden, it's the Chisholm Trail Parkway. Look at that. Probably some backroom marketing deals going on there. So, to compare the modern narrative, modern Chisholm Trail narrative and the facts, is kind of like comparing that crossbred bull to the bull that carries the historic genetics. One don't resemble the other one. The genetics were selectively manipulated over a period of time to produce a specific result, and that result was longer horns. And you see that the result doesn't look anything like the original. It's the same way with the modern Chisholm Trail narrative, especially over the last 20 years. This story and the information has been manipulated, sometimes unintentionally, sometimes intentionally, especially over the last 20 years, to produce a specific result. And that result is to take a popular trail name that they wrote books, produced movies, and made songs about, take that trail name of that little short trail that we saw during the trail driving days and apply it to a much longer route that had more cattle driven on it and was used for a longer period of time, and just ignore the facts. So it's time, probably past time, to set the record straight and stop representing folklore and stories that might be great stories, but if they can't be proven, stop representing that stuff as historical fact. You can still tell the stories. The tourist will still come. A promoter here in Fort Worth told me several years ago, if tourists think it's the Chisholm Trail, it's going to be the Chisholm Trail. Simple as that. But to me, and to a lot of people, it gets more interesting when you can prove it. So respect the facts and evidence, but enjoy the lore and legend, and let's put everything in a proper context. And then this is the book. And that concludes the program, unless somebody has questions.
Leanna is going to field the questions in the room, and I will read off any from the Zoom attendees. For the ones in the room, if you will repeat their question before you answer it.
Okay?
All right.
Are we ready?
Yeah, go ahead. Any questions?
Any questions?
Do you find any use in the name McCoy Trail?
Barely. I think there is a marker off of 8th Avenue that calls it the McCoy Trail. And when I think it was the Fort Worth Diamond Jubilee in the 1920s, some old trail drivers got together and marked the trail through Fort Worth. They may have called it the McCoy Trail during that period after Joseph McCoy, who made the deal with the railroad to establish the railhead in Abilene, Kansas, and was the reason that this trail existed in the first place. So there's a little bit about that. And that would be a logical reason, but that name is not used a whole lot. It's that name, once they started writing poems and songs about Chisholm Trail, that overshadowed everything else. Did you have one?
Real quick question. How can I trust my map to get me home from here now?
Good question. Who did you get it from? If you got it from a promoter, you better check it.
Well, my cousin worked on researching the Chisholm Trail here back in the 60s or 70s. Whatever became of that?
Of their research, or
Yeah, their research.
I don't know. Did they do it individually, or was it for a group?
There
Or
was some group he was with,
oh, I don't know.
and they
Don't
thought
have
they
any
found
idea.
the Chisholm Trail.
Don't have any idea.
So they
Yeah,
were
they-
wrong, huh?
There's no doubting that the cattle trail came through Fort Worth, just like it came up basically up generally along 8th Avenue, Hemp Hill, over to the southeastern edge of downtown, and then up east of downtown, basically where the railroad tracks are. In fact, they just put last year, I think, a historic marker out at Daggett's Crossing out in the big loop of the Trinity River. And then they crossed the Trinity there at Daggett's, and then headed on out kind of generally towards the Speedway and all of that, and the Wise-Denton County line, and then on north from there. But I don't know specifically about that research. So. Yes?
I was wondering if you could just follow up a little bit more about the significance of Daggett's Crossing.
Daggett's Crossing, yeah. I don't know all the history, but it had a hard rock. My understanding is it had a hard rock bottom. Daggett was part of the Daggett. I don't remember which. I think it was CB. He was part of the Daggett family that were the early settlers of Fort Worth and founders. One of the things he did, among others, was he established this crossing, and Cold Springs Road used to be the main drag north and south into and out of Fort Worth. This crossing was, the river had a hard rock bottom. This was before the levee project that straightened out the riverbed. He established a crossing there and may have had a ferry, and this was close to the main drag, Cold Springs Road, and you can take the southern part of Cold Springs Road on one side of the river that's in the industrial area, and then where it picks up on the other side and connect the dots to generally see where that was. I don't remember the dates of use of this, but that was basically the main way into and out of Fort Worth going north-south, and that's where the cattle herds crossed. I've had some people say, well, they crossed the Trinity farther west, but if they did that, then they would have to cross a couple of different forks of the Trinity. So why would you risk doing that and losing some of your herd or some of your drovers versus coming on over and crossing one time and then going on north up the prairie?
So we've got a comment and a couple of questions from one of our Zoomers, Skipper Steely. The question is, the comment is, I have the same trouble trying to write the real history of the Dr. Pepper formula. Tell them that John Chisholm, with a U, is not Jesse Chisholm, with Holm, though they are probably kin to a guy in eastern Tennessee. And then also, didn't trails move over constantly to find good grass to fatten the cattle as they went?
Yes.
So, yes. And didn't Jesse come into Texas a brief time to gather goods for his store?
Don't know if that was the reason why he came. He came into Texas to help Sam Houston negotiate treaties during the Republic of Texas with the Comanche and other tribes. I don't know if he came here to gather anything for his trading post or not. I don't have that documented that he did. I'll just say that.
Sure.
He may have, but I don't have any documentation that shows that. And yes, John Simpson Chisholm, Chishum, was a totally different person than Jesse Chisholm, Chisholm, who had the trading post in Indian Territory and who the trail is named for. Those were two different people that were not the same person, had nothing to do with each other. As far as I can tell, they never met, but because of the phonetic sounds of their name, some people over years have said, well, the Chisholm Trail must be named after a cattleman, so it's got to be named after John Chisholm. But that's not the case.
So Skipper also asks, do you have maps of the drives to Little Rock and Shreveport?
I do not.
Okay.
I do not have anything that shows. I do not have anything that shows a cattle trail to those points. I might be able to look on some maps that I have that shows a road or a trail that they could have traveled along that might not have been designated as a cattle trail on a map. So,
Any
but
other,
there were numerous ways to get from point A to point B.
any other questions in here?
About when does the rail take over from the driving the cattle?
That's a good question. The Katy Railroad extended south across Indian Territory from Kansas, and they hit Denison, I think, in 1871, 1872. So once that happened, cattlemen had an option to drive to Denison and put their cattle on a rail car and ship them on north into Kansas, and then from there on to Chicago or wherever. But this was new, and cattlemen did not want to pay for anything they didn't have to. Some would not even want to pay the fee for a ferry to carry their herd or their wagon across a river unless they had to do it. So you had issues with freight rates. Freight rates were new. That whole rail process was something new. They soon found that cattle arrived at the destination in much better physical condition if they walked and grazed their way to the destination rather than put them on cattle cars and shipped them. Because, trains went, 15, 20 miles an hour top speed back then. So unless they stopped several times before their destination, you had to feed and water the cattle and do certain things, or your cattle were going to be in bad shape. So you had some issues. This was an evolving process. And then as railroads continued construction, then that technology and cattle cars and that whole process, the more they did it, the better they got at it, just like most other things.
That's how my grandfather came down here.
Yeah.
Was because he was a cattleman.
Yeah, yeah.
Bought from the ranchers and
Yeah.
sold to the plates,
Yeah.
packing plants.
Yeah, so and then they found when rail was available to do this, they found that if they put shipped Texas cattle long distances, like up to, and then put them on a ranch in Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, they found that the proliferation of Texas fever, which they didn't know what caused it at the time, but it was a disease carried by longhorns from certain coastal areas of Texas caused by ticks. They didn't know this until the trail driving days were just about over. All they knew was that if longhorns came by, if you drove longhorns through the pastures that I was using for my domestic herd, a couple of weeks after your longhorns passed, my domestic herd started getting sick and dying. So the next guy that comes up with longhorns, you ain't coming through here, buddy. And that caused a lot of problems. But they found that because the cattle shipped on rail got there quicker, and they figured this out after they figured out that the tick was causing the problem, and I think that breakthrough was in 1893, 1894. So trail drives were over by then, but the shipping cattle by rail did not allow the ticks to complete a life cycle and fall off of the animal and basically die and break that life cycle by taking the time to walk and graze along the way. Ship them by rail. Those ticks were still active when they got to the destination, so you saw Texas fever blow up. So then you saw resistance to Texas cattle in whole new areas where it had not been before. So I mean, there's a lot of things that came together during this period. There was changes in technology, just a lot of different things that just all meshed together. And there's probably a dozen different subjects that we could do presentations on that all relate to this. Yes.
How do you think misconceptions and discrepancies, awareness of that could be increased, and maybe how some of those misconceptions could be ultimately corrected?
Can you repeat the question?
How do I think the misconceptions have increased?
Or how do you think awareness in the general public could increase regarding these misconceptions in history, and how do you think that it could ultimately be corrected on a widespread level?
Okay. Part of that was due to some of the examples that we saw in the presentation. I can only speculate as to what their reasons might have been for finding the original document. Well, that doesn't say what I want it to. That doesn't fit my story, so I'm just going to change it. I'm going to draw a new map, and I'm going to plug this trail in wherever I want it to be to fit my story. And then I'm going to publish that in my book or whatever. I can't speak to their motives. Over the last 20 years or so, since these concrete marker posts started to appear in Fort Worth, or started to appear in Texas, I think that has been driven by the possibility to get a Chisholm National Historic Trail designation through the National Park Service, because I've got a newspaper article that was published, I think it was in the late 90s. I started to include it in this, but figured we were already running long enough, running too long. So, but I think it was published in the late 1990s, and it involved, they interviewed a person, I think it was with the Fort Worth Convention and Visitors Bureau back then. And they said it was something like, and part of this I agree with, part of it I don't. We have this cowboy culture here, the cattle drives, the stockyards, this whole cowboy history of the American West right here in Fort Worth. people are already coming from all over the world to see it, but we don't take full advantage of it. We had a cattle trail come right through Fort Worth. The Chisholm Trail came right through Fort Worth, and we're not taking advantage of that. If we can get this designated as a and I don't know if this terminology is correct or not, a Texas Heritage Travel Trail, or whatever the terminology is, through Texas Historical Commission, then that would free up, that would qualify it for this money and funding to come in. Money and funding. Ding, 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 ding. Okay, there's part of your motivation. Then, not long after that, somebody, and I don't know when it started, but somebody or some groups got together and started talking to some politicians about getting an act passed in Congress to authorize the National Park Service to study this trail for potential inclusion as a National Historic Trail. Okay? I don't know when that started, but the legislation that authorized the Park Service to do that study was in 2009. I don't know how long they talked about it before then. But when you start looking at this, Texas Heritage Travel Trail, late 1990s, okay? Concrete Chisholm Trail marker posts start going in Texas, summer of 2000. 2009, Congress authorizes National Park Service to study the Chisholm Trail through Fort Worth for a possible National Historic Trail. More markers are going up all during this time. And in fact, I don't what the heck, I don't usually say this, but after I started doing research in 2011, after I started doing research, just to satisfy my own curiosity, it later turned into a book project. I didn't intend to write a book when I started, but those concrete marker posts, I was contacted by somebody that was involved. Once they found out I was interested in this topic, I think they saw me as potential new blood, and I was contacted and asked if I would like to join in this effort to get the Chisholm Trail marked through Texas and get these markers put up. And I asked, what evidence do you have to support the markers? J. Frank Dobie said so in 1930. Okay, well, and I didn't really know a lot at that point. I just started. And I said, well, do you have any documentation from the trail driving days to support what J. Frank Dobie said in 1930 and what your markers are saying? J. Frank Dobie said it, that's good enough for us. And then he told me that part of the strategy for putting out these markers, they're the same markers that were put out during the 1990s in Oklahoma, across Oklahoma. Part of their strategy for putting them up in Texas is we're working on getting this designated as a National Historic Trail. And if we get these markers put up in Texas, we'll get the trail marked, and we can tell National Park Service that if they'll do this designation, we already have Chisholm Trail markers up all through Texas. And then when he told me that, I thought, well, I've got a lot of other stuff right now, but if you find evidence or documentation from the trail driving days to support what you're telling me and what these markers say, then call me and we'll talk. If all you're going by is what somebody said 50 years after the fact, I'm not touching that with a 10-foot pole. And I never heard from him again. So.
Well, we have a related comment from one of our virtual attendees who says, there is a Chisholm Trail marker in Bonita, Texas, just outside of Nocona, Texas, similar to the marker
Yes.
illustrated in one of your previous slides. Do you know what documentation those markers are based on? And from what you just said, I would say J. Frank Dobie.
The one in Bonita, I know where the marker is, a little roadside park there. It's east of St. Joe. Okay, after the trail shifted over to Red River Station, the trail turned to the northwest in southern Cook County, went past St. Joe and Bonita, and then, in fact, the photo on the back flap of the book was taken at a ranch not far from where they're talking about, that over the background of that photo overlooks that part of the trail that headed toward Red River Station back in the day. But that marker is same thing. J. Frank Dobie said so on the trail name, on the Chisholm Trail name, but the marker placement is accurate according to the data and the maps and everything, as far as I can tell, that's actually where the cattle close to where the cattle passed. But as far as the trail name goes, and this is true with any Chisholm Trail markers in Texas pretty much, the cattle trail likely passed by or close to where that marker is, but as far as the trail name, can't prove it.
So
All the documentation
just putting
contradicts it.
Chisholm on it makes it more authentic. You could say cattle drive and it'd be true, but you can't.
If tourists think it's the Chisholm Trail, it's going to be the Chisholm Trail.
Now they need to add a
That's-
sign on top, this way to the Chisholm Trail.
Yeah, if you had an insert and you put 2 Chisholm Trail on those concrete markers, no argument with that.
All right, well, thank you so much.
Thanks.
It's been a very informative